In the dusty archives of medical history, there are files that were never meant to be opened. These are the journals of physicians who witnessed things that defy the very logic of human existence. In the mid-1800s, when science was still in its infancy, a story emerged that blurred the line between flesh and stone. It is the story of a child whose body was slowly, cell by cell, transforming into a living, breathing statue. The setting was a small, modest home on the outskirts of London. The year was 1832, a damp May morning. 7-year-old Thomas Madoolis attempted to rise from his bed, but he felt a strange, chilling stiffness in his neck. He called out for his mother, but when she came to inspect him, she discovered a small, hard lump between his back and his neck. This was no ordinary swelling or bruise. To the touch, it felt as hard as oak or river stone. Thomas's parents, members of the hard-working labor class, initially dismissed it as a minor injury from play. They applied warm compresses and herbal poultices, but the lump did not fade. Instead, it began to creep. Within a matter of weeks, Thomas's neck became locked in a single position. He could no longer turn his head to look at the world around him. The innocent curiosity in his eyes was replaced by a growing, hollow fear. He felt as if something invisible, something ancient, was tightening its grip around his frame. When the local doctor was finally summoned, he was utterly baffled. At this time, medicine still clung to the ancient theory of the four humors. The doctor hypothesized that perhaps the boy's body was suffering from an excess of black bile. He recommended bloodletting, slicing the boy's arm to drain the toxic fluids. But as the blood flowed out, Thomas only grew weaker, and the mysterious hardness spread further, claiming his shoulders. For the doctors of the 19th century, this was a riddle without a name. They had read of smallpox, cholera, and consumption, but a child turning into bone while still alive, it was beyond their comprehension. Thomas's shoulders were now frozen in place. He could no longer lift his hands to feed himself. His mother would feed him small morsels of bread, her tears falling onto his plate, while he remained a prisoner within his own skin. Whispers began to haunt the town. The 19th century public lived in a world where superstition often held more weight than science. People began to say the Madoolis family was under an ancient curse. Rumors spread that perhaps his mother had looked upon a stone idol during her pregnancy, and the impression was now manifesting in her son. The boy who once ran through the cobblestone streets was now a curiosity, a tragic spectacle hidden away in the corner of a dark room. As the days turned into months, Thomas's body became a battlefield where nature itself turned against him. His muscles, designed for movement and grace, were being methodically replaced by solid bone. It was an imprisonment where the bars were not made of iron, but of his own skeleton. Music shift, heightened suspense, and dark intrigue. But the most terrifying revelation was yet to come. When the family finally saved enough to call a prominent surgeon to examine Thomas, the man made a mistake that would turn the boy's life into a living nightmare. The surgeon decided he would simply cut the extra bone away. He believed he could carve out the hardness and restore the boy's movement. He did not realize that he was about to poke a sleeping monster, a biological storm that only grows more violent when provoked. The moment the first incision was made into Thomas's skin, a chain reaction began that would send shivers down the spines of medical experts for a century to come. What was that reaction? And how did Thomas's body retaliate against the surgeon's blade? We will uncover that in the next segment.
By the winter of 1832, the Madoolis household had become a place of hushed whispers and heavy shadows. 7-year-old Thomas was no longer the vibrant boy who chased hoops down the London alleys. He was becoming something else, a biological anomaly that the neighbors spoke of in fearful tones. His torso was becoming a rigid cage. The muscles of his back, once supple and strong, had transformed into solid plates of bone that felt as cold and unyielding as the cobblestones outside his window. His father, a man of calloused hands and a weary soul, had spent his last shillings to bring in Dr. Alistair Thorne, a surgeon of high repute who was known for his decisive methods. In the 1830s, surgery was not a delicate art of healing. It was a brutal race against pain and infection. There was no anesthesia to dull the agony, no germ theory to guide the cleanliness of the instruments. A surgeon's skill was measured by the speed of his blade. Thorne arrived at the house with a leather roll of silver-handled knives and an air of supreme confidence. He looked at the hard, protruding lumps on Thomas's back and saw not a mystery, but a mechanical problem. "It is an overgrowth," he declared, his voice booming in the cramped room. "A calcified tumor that has bound the muscles. We shall simply carve it out and set the boy free." Thomas was placed on the kitchen table, held down by his father and a neighbor. He looked at the ceiling, his eyes wide with a terror that no child should ever know. As Dr. Thorne sharpened his scalpel, the room fell silent, save for the crackling of the hearth. The first incision was deep. Thomas's scream echoed through the thin walls, a sound so piercing it caused the birds in the eaves to take flight. But as Thorne's blade met the tumor, the surgeon felt a strange resistance. It wasn't the soft resistance of a cyst or the grained texture of a common growth. It was like cutting into ivory. Thorne worked with a frantic intensity, beads of sweat dripping from his forehead onto the boy's skin. He hacked and chiseled away at the hard masses, believing that by removing the stone, he was removing the disease. After an hour that felt like an eternity, the surgeon stepped back, his apron stained crimson. He had removed several large chunks of bone from the boy's back and shoulders. "He will be stiff for a time," Thorne remarked as he stitched the wounds with silk thread, "but the blockage is gone. Nature will do the rest." Nature, however, had a far more sinister plan. For the first few days, Thomas lay in a feverish stupor. His mother, Mary, stayed by his side, bathing his forehead with vinegar and water, praying for a miracle. But as the surgical wounds began to close, a horrific transformation took place, one that would redefine the boundaries of medical horror. The body did not heal the way a normal human body heals. In a person suffering from Fibrodysplasia Ossificans Progressiva, though no one knew that name then, any trauma to the tissue acts as a signal. The body's repair mechanism goes into a frantic, localized overdrive. Instead of creating scar tissue to heal the wound, the body creates bone. Within 2 weeks, the sites where Dr. Thorne had operated did not just return to their previous state, they exploded with new growth. It was as if the body had taken the surgeon's intrusion as a declaration of war. The new bone was thicker, jagged, and more aggressive than before. It didn't just replace what was lost, it branched out like the roots of a cursed tree, weaving through the remaining healthy muscles of his back and chest. The tragedy was visible to the naked eye. The scars on Thomas's back became elevated ridges of bone, so sharp they threatened to pierce the skin from the inside. His ribcage, once flexible enough to allow for deep breaths, was now being fused into a solid, unmoving box of calcium. Each breath became a shallow, painful struggle. He was being entombed in a sarcophagus of his own making. Word of the surgical miracle turned into a surgical horror. Dr. Thorne, hearing of the boy's worsening condition, refused to return to the house, fearing for his reputation. He claimed the family had failed to follow his post-operative instructions, or perhaps that the boy was cursed by a constitutional taint. The medical community of London began to take notice, but not for compassion. Thomas was no longer a patient, he was becoming a specimen. By the spring of 1833, the transformation had reached a critical stage. Thomas's right arm was now permanently locked in a half-bent position across his chest, as if he were forever guarding his heart. He could no longer move his elbow or his wrist. His hand, once capable of holding a pen or a toy, was now a rigid claw. The skin over the new bone was stretched so tight it became translucent, showing the angry red vascularity beneath. The psychological toll was perhaps even more devastating than the physical one. Thomas was a prisoner who was fully conscious of his prison's construction. He felt every flare-up, describing them as a burning, throbbing heat that preceded the hardening of a new area. He watched his own body betray him day by day. He would wake up and find that he could no longer wiggle his toes, or that his jaw felt slightly tighter than it had the night before. The local priest was called in once more, not for a blessing, but for an exorcism. The religious fervor of the time could find no other explanation for a child turning to stone. They believed a demon was calcifying the boy's soul, turning him into a statue as punishment for some perceived sin of the ancestors. The chanting and the incest filled the small room, but the bone continued to grow, indifferent to the prayers and the rituals. Mary Madoolis looked at her son, once a boy of flesh and blood, now a creature of bone and sorrow, and realized that the doctors had no answers, and the priests had no cure. They were in a dark territory where no map existed.
The medical journals of the time began to circulate his case under the title, The Ossified Boy of London. Scientists from across Europe began to send letters requesting to measure him, to poke him with needles, to study the living skeleton. As we move into the third segment, we will see how Thomas's case became a global sensation, drawing him into the world of freak shows and scientific curiosity, and the heartbreaking choice his family had to make to survive. The boy who was turning to stone was about to become the most famous and the most exploited child in England.
By late 1833, the walls of the Madoolis home could no longer contain the secret of the stone boy. Poverty had descended upon the family like a suffocating shroud. Thomas's father had lost his job due to the time spent caring for his son, and the medical bills from charlatans and surgeons had drained their meager savings. It was then that a new kind of visitor began knocking on their door, not doctors looking to heal, but entrepreneurs looking to profit. This was the era of the freak show and the anatomy museum, where the deformities of the few became the entertainment of the many. Promoters offered the family sums of money that seemed like a fortune in exchange for exhibiting Thomas to the public. For a time, his parents resisted, horrified by the thought of their son being gawked at like a circus animal. But as the winter grew colder and the cupboards grew emptier, the choice became one of survival or starvation. Thomas was eventually moved to a private room in London, where for a few shillings, members of the public and the medical community could witness the ossified wonder. He sat in a specially constructed chair, his body now a twisted architecture of bone. The transformation had claimed his hips and his knees. His legs were locked in a seated position, frozen forever as if he were mid-sentence in a chair. To move him, he had to be carried like a piece of furniture. Among the visitors were the most prestigious medical minds of the Royal College of Surgeons. They came with calipers and measuring tapes, treating Thomas not as a 10-year-old boy, but as a biological curiosity. They debated his case in front of him as if he were already a corpse. Is it a failure of the lymphatic system? One would ask. Or perhaps a rare form of gout that has migrated to the muscle, another would suggest. Thomas would listen to these debates, his eyes, the only part of him that still moved with ease, darting from one face to another, filled with a silent, searing intelligence. The most disturbing aspect for the doctors was the second skeleton. They observed that Thomas did not just have hard muscles. He was growing an entirely new, disordered skeletal system over his original one. Bony bridges had formed between his spine and his scapula. His back was no longer a column of vertebrae, but a solid, jagged wall of bone. In a tragic irony, the very science that sought to understand him was what tormented him most. Doctors would often press on his flare-ups, the swollen, hot areas where new bone was forming, to test his pain response. Thomas could not recoil. He could not pull away. He could only endure. He became a master of internalizing his agony, retreating into a world of books and imagination, since the physical world had become a cage. His mother would read to him for hours, her voice the only bridge back to his lost childhood. However, the exhibitions took a toll on his health. The air in the crowded London rooms was thick with the smoke of oil lamps and the breath of hundreds of strangers. Thomas's lungs, already restricted by his hardened ribcage, began to fail. He could only take sips of air, his chest unable to expand more than a fraction of an inch. His voice, once clear, became a rasping whisper as the muscles of his neck and jaw began to tighten, threatening to lock his mouth shut forever. The medical journals of 1834 began to feature detailed lithographs of his condition. These drawings showed a boy who looked more like a geological formation than a human being. The term Myositis ossificans began to appear in the literature, a cold Latin name for a hot, burning nightmare. The segment of society that didn't see him as a scientific marvel saw him as an omen. Religious extremists would stand outside the exhibition rooms, claiming that Thomas was a physical manifestation of a hardened heart, a living metaphor for the sins of a modernizing world. They called for him to be hidden away, believing his monstrosity was a curse upon the city. Through all of this, Thomas remained a boy who simply wanted to go home. He missed the feeling of grass beneath his feet, a sensation he would never feel again. He missed the simple act of leaning back in bed, an impossibility now that his spine was fused into a forward-leaning arc. He was a living statue, a monument to a disease that had no cure and no mercy. As we conclude this segment, Thomas faces the ultimate terror of FOP, the locking of the jaw. If his jaw fuses, he will be unable to eat or speak. The boy who turned to stone is about to lose his only remaining connection to the world of the living, his voice. We will see how he prepares for the end in segment 2.
By the year 1835, the Stone Boy had become a legend of the London medical circles. But for Thomas, life had shrunk to the dimensions of a single room and the limits of his own skin. The second skeleton had now woven a web so intricate and so dense that his original frame was entirely obscured. But the most terrifying development was not the freezing of his hips or the solidification of his spine. It was a subtle, persistent ache in his face. One morning, while trying to eat a piece of soft fruit, Thomas felt a sharp, crystalline snap near his ear. It wasn't the sound of a bone breaking, it was the sound of a bone forming. The tendons and ligaments of his jaw, the masseter muscles that allow us to chew and speak, were beginning to ossify. In the world of FOP, this is known as the final door. Once the jaw locks, the patient is essentially entombed behind a wall of bone, unable to take solid food, and eventually unable to cry out. Dr. Gresham, a colleague of the surgeons who had previously studied Thomas, visited him during this period. He noted with a mix of horror and fascination that Thomas's mouth could only open a mere 3 millimeters, barely enough to slide a thin straw or a silver spoon through. The boy's teeth, once healthy, began to decay because they could not be cleaned. The constant pain of a locked jaw, combined with the inability to yawn or sigh, created a psychological pressure that Gresham described as unbearable to witness. Thomas's mother, Mary, became his lifeline in a literal sense. She began to grind his food into a thin, watery gruel, pouring it through the tiny gap in his teeth. She spent hours every day just ensuring he received enough calories to stay alive. But as the jaw locked, so did the chest. The bony armor around his lungs had thickened to the point where his ribs were no longer separate bones, but a single solid plate. This is the point where the Stone Boy became a living clock. Every breath was a calculated effort. Because he could not expand his lungs, his oxygen intake was minimal. He was constantly in a state of air hunger, a feeling similar to drowning in slow motion. His heart had to pump faster to compensate for the lack of oxygen, further exhausting a body that was already fighting a losing battle against its own chemistry. During this time, Thomas's intellect seemed to sharpen as his body failed. He spent his days in a state of forced meditation. He told his mother in a raspy, barely audible whisper that he felt as though he were leaving his body while still inside it. He began to experience vivid dreams of flying, of running through the London docks, of feelings of weightlessness, the mind's desperate rebellion against a body that weighed 100 pounds more than it should because of the excess bone. The medical community, meanwhile, was growing frustrated. They had tried every 19th century cure. They applied leeches to his jaw to suck out the heat. They used mechanical screws to try and force his mouth open, an agonizing procedure that only resulted in Thomas's body retaliating by growing even more bone in the injured area. The doctors were learning the hard way what modern science now confirms. In FOP, any attempt to fix the problem through force only makes the stone grow faster and stronger. Thomas's room became a site of quiet tragedy. He was no longer exhibited to the public. He was too frail, too ghostly. He sat in his chair, his head bowed forward because the muscles at the back of his neck had turned into a solid pillar, pulling his chin toward his chest. He looked like a man deep in prayer, or perhaps a man waiting for a blow that never comes.
The neighbors, who once viewed him with superstitious dread, now viewed him with a strange kind of reverence. He was the silent saint of the slums. They brought flowers and small trinkets, placing them on the windowsill. They saw in Thomas a courage that was quiet and terrifying. He never complained, he never screamed, partly because he couldn't, but mostly because he had reached a state of resignation that was beyond his years. As the segment closes, we see the arrival of a final harsh winter. The cold air is the enemy of the stone boy, for every cough and every shiver risks further injury to his muscles, and every injury leads to more bone. The end is no longer a question of if, but when. In segment 5, we will witness the final days of Thomas Madoolis, and the extraordinary request he made before the stone reached his heart.
The winter of 1836 was one of the harshest London had seen in decades. For a boy made of bone, the cold was more than an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. Thomas Madoolis was now 13 years old, though he had the appearance of an ancient, weathered statue. He was almost entirely ossified. From his hips to his neck, his body was a single, fused mass. He could no longer be moved from his chair to his bed without the risk of his skin tearing over the sharp, bony protrusions that had formed beneath his surface. His world had narrowed to the view from a single window and the face of his mother. His jaw was now completely fused. Not even a silver coin could pass between his teeth. He survived on liquids dripped into the small gap where a tooth had been removed, a mercy of nature that allowed him to avoid immediate starvation. But the stone was moving inward, toward the very engine of life. Dr. Gresham returned to the house in January. He found Thomas sitting in a darkened corner, the room kept warm by a small, sputtering coal fire. The doctor noticed that Thomas's breathing had become a terrifying sound, a wet, shallow rattle. The second skeleton had finally encased his lungs in a cage so tight that his diaphragm could no longer pull in enough air. Every breath was a feat of sheer will. "He is drowning on dry land," Gresham wrote in his private notes. "The bone has reached the intercostal muscles. He is a prisoner in a cell that is shrinking by the hour." Despite the physical horror, Thomas's mind remained as clear as a bell. Since he could no longer speak through his locked jaw, he and his mother developed a language of the eyes, a single blink for yes, two for no. Through this painstaking method, Thomas made a request that would haunt Dr. Gresham for the rest of his life. He wanted to see the sky one last time. His father and two neighbors rigged a system of pulleys and a sturdy wooden board to carry Thomas out to the small courtyard. It was a perilous journey. Any jolt could cause a flare-up or break the brittle, abnormal bone. As they settled him under the gray, wintry London sky, the boy who had spent years turning into stone looked up. For a few minutes, the freezing air on his face seemed to give him a surge of life. He watched the soot-stained clouds and the distant flight of crows. In that moment, he wasn't a medical specimen or a freak show attraction. He was a boy. But the exertion of the trip triggered a final, violent response from his body. That night, Thomas developed a high fever. In FOP, a fever often signals a massive new flare-up. The heat radiating from his chest was so intense it could be felt through his clothing. His body, in its final, confused attempt to repair itself, began a frantic process of ossification around his heart and the large vessels of his chest. Mary Madoolis stayed awake, holding his cold, rigid hand. She sang the same lullabies she had sung when he was a toddler running through the parks. Thomas looked at her, his eyes filled with an unbearable mixture of love and exhaustion. He was tired of the fight. He was tired of being a statue. In the early hours of February 14, 1836, the rhythmic rattle of his breath slowed. The bony cage around his chest finally refused to expand even a millimeter more. Thomas took one last, tiny sip of air, his eyes fixed on his mother's face, and then the tension that had held his body for 6 years simply evaporated. The stone boy was finally still.
When Dr. Gresham arrived to pronounce the death, he found Mary still holding her son's hand. He noted that in death, Thomas looked strangely peaceful, though his body remained as rigid as ever. Even in the transition from life to death, the bone did not soften. He was as unyielding in his passing as he had been in his final years. But the story of Thomas Madoolis did not end with his last breath. In fact, for the world of science, it was only just beginning. Thomas had made one final request through his eye blink code. He knew that the doctors were fascinated by his body. He knew they wanted to cut him open to see the stone inside. Instead of fearing this, he had signaled his consent, on one condition. He wanted his body to be used so that no other child would ever have to become a statue. In segment 6, we will go behind the closed doors of the autopsy theater. We will see the shocking revelations found inside Thomas's chest and how his second skeleton became one of the most important medical exhibits in history, leading us directly to the modern-day search for a cure.
The death of Thomas Madoolis in 1836 did not result in a quiet funeral and a forgotten grave. Instead, it marked the beginning of a scientific odyssey that would span nearly 2 centuries. In accordance with his final, silent wishes, Thomas's body was donated to the Royal College of Surgeons. The physicians who had spent years observing him from a distance were finally granted the opportunity to look beneath the surface of the stone boy. The autopsy was conducted in a cold, stone-floored theater, attended by the leading anatomists of the Victorian era. As they made the first incisions, the room fell into a stunned silence. What they found was a biological marvel that defied every known law of anatomy. Thomas was not just a boy with extra bone, he was a boy with an entirely separate secondary skeletal system that had woven itself through his muscles like the roots of a strangler fig. The second skeleton was a jagged, chaotic web of bone that had fused his spine, his ribs, and his limbs into a single, immovable structure. His heart and lungs were found to be healthy, yet they had been crushed by the very cage meant to protect them. The anatomists realized that Thomas's body had essentially engaged in a civil war. The repair mechanism of his own DNA had mistaken his soft tissue for injury, responding by building a fortress of bone where there should have been only flex and flow. For decades, Thomas's skeleton remained a centerpiece of medical education in London. It was a haunting reminder of the ossified man, a specimen that drew thousands of students who marveled at the sheer power of a disease that could turn a human being into an ivory sculpture. But for a long time, the how and the why remained a mystery. The Victorian doctors had the what, the bone itself, but the why was locked away in a code they could not yet read, the human genome. It wasn't until the late 20th and early 21st centuries that Thomas's legacy bore its most significant fruit. In 2006, researchers at the University of Pennsylvania finally identified the FOP gene, a single mutation in a gene called ACVR1. This gene acts like a broken light switch. In a healthy person, it tells the body to make bone only where it belongs. In Thomas and in the roughly 4,000 people living with FOP today, that switch is stuck in the on position. Any bump, any bruise, any viral infection triggers the switch, and the body begins to build the stone jail. Today, the skeleton of Harry Eastlack, a man who suffered from the same condition as Thomas and made a similar donation to the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, stands as the modern equivalent of Thomas's legacy. These living skeletons have allowed scientists to test new drugs and therapies. We are now in a new era where clinical trials are actually stopping the growth of new bone. The nightmare that consumed Thomas's childhood is finally being dismantled by the very science he helped advance. The story of Thomas Madoolis is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit.
He lived in a time of darkness, superstition, and brutal medical practices, yet he maintained a dignity that touched everyone who saw him. He was a prisoner who left behind the keys to his own cell so that others might one day walk free. As we look back at 1832, we no longer see a cursed boy or a freak of nature. We see a pioneer. We see a young boy who endured the unimaginable and in his final act of eye-blink consent contributed more to medical science than many doctors of his time. The next time you look at a statue, remember Thomas. Remember that beneath the stone there was a heart that beat with courage, a mind that dreamt of the sky, and a legacy that will never be forgotten as long as science seeks to heal. The boy who turned to stone has, in a way, become immortal, not as a curiosity, but as a beacon of hope for every child born with a riddle in their blood.